Andrew Wilson, welcome back to the Talent Equation podcast. I don't know how many appearances you've made, but you definitely feel like you're one of the sort of top returning guests. So it's great to have you back.
Thanks. Great to be back. It's been a little while, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. It feels like it's been a little while. I think we've got a lot to catch up on.
Yeah.
So starting point, I just wanted to because people may not have listened to your previous episodes, I wonder if you could just quickly give people the sort of your backstory in this space. And it'd be useful also maybe for you to just touch on a little bit about, what you're working on at the moment, because you've got some exciting projects on the go, including opportunities for people to come together and learn together. So, yeah, catch us up.
Cool. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Wilson. I'm a reader in psychology at Leeds Beckett University in Leeds in the UK. And I'm an ecological psychologist. I'm a sit in the lab doing the basic science kind of guy. Is my main bread and butter, and obviously I'm a university lecturer as well. But I've been doing this now for God, it's 20 years in August since I got my PhD. I've been around for a little while now. And so, yeah, so my interests are, I'm interested broadly in learning, actually, as fundamentally, I'm skill acquisition in the sports context, but I'm interested in how we perceive our environments, how we use that to control our behaviors, and importantly, how we come to be able to do that through learning. So, learning and yeah, I've been really focused a lot the last few years on questions of learning using sort of basic lab tasks, but trying to use those tasks to answer bigger questions about learning. And the thing that's really got my attention over the last couple of years is thinking about transfer of learning from an academic research point of view. And obviously that feeds into the whole point of in coaching, right? The whole thing about training is that you're teaching someone in one environment and you need that learning to show up in another environment. How do we make that happen? What do you do to facilitate that and to make it likely? And it turns out, historically it's a complicated question. But I've been doing a lot of work lately, and unsurprisingly, it's about affordances and information, and it's about what's present in the training environment, what needs to be there. And so I've been engaging with those questions at a pretty basic science kind of level, but always just kind of with one eye on other things. Um, so yeah, so that's one interest. I've also become really interested recently in connecting affordance-based control, and so thinking about how affordances actually feature in the coordination and control of our actions, connecting that up to sort of what are known as motor abundance methods. So a lot of your listeners, I think, will be familiar with names like Bernstein, maybe, and they will have heard of the degrees of freedom problem or the motor abundance solution, the bliss of motor abundance. The idea that we have more movement elements available to us than we ever need at any given one moment. And so the question is, how do we use that flexibility? How do we control it and make it manageable? But how do we keep the flexibility and creativity that it entails? And so my big push right now is I'm connecting a lot, or trying to connect all the research methods that get thrown at those kinds of questions, connecting that up to affordance-based control, because I think it's affordances that make it all work. That's the pitch anyway. So that's some new stuff. And some colleagues of mine and I have been having discussions over the last 12, 18 months trying to really figure out how to put all that together. And I've just submitted an article summarizing all my thoughts recently on that. So that's kind of the science stuff that I get up to, and that I've been up to recently. What else?
Well, there's some good jumping off points there, because I've got a couple of areas you've piqued my interest in.
Yeah,
Um,
cool.
but the starting point was, I remember in our previous conversations, you talked about this sort of, there's a few hard problems in ecological psychology, it seems. They talk about the hard problem of consciousness, and I think
Yeah,
ecological psychology has got a number of these. One of them, though, one of the hard problems that you've talked about is this notion of transfer and transfer of
yeah,
learning. And I remember being slightly crestfallen when we spoke previously because you sort of, I was looking for some, sort of fairly concrete responses to sort of say, well, the ecological approach has got some real clarity as to that it provides a greater transfer of learning. It turns
right.
out that it's a little bit more of a nuanced question than that.
Um,
So I'm wondering though, given that there's been a bit of time since we last spoke, and given that you've been working in the area,
Yep.
like what you've learned, and whether there is any more clarity as to, because obviously the big debate that happens within the sports space, because this is what tends to happen in the sports space. And if you've seen any of the stuff that's happened in the world of, say, grappling and BJJ, which seems to have grabbed hold, or at least got a toe hold or a heel hook, maybe,
Mhm.
into the ecological space, and a lot of practitioners quite intrigued and excited and utilizing this thing and debating utility and debating effectiveness as a training modality. And the question always comes back to this idea of transfer. Does the
Yep.
practice, does utilizing an ecological approach and utilizing ecological ideas in practice lead to greater transfer? So I'd be interested just to sort of riff on that subject for a bit and see what, where you are in your thinking as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, sure. So I was just thinking, so right, okay, there's a few things going on. Let me start at the beginning then. So the one thing that everybody agrees is probably true is that you will see transfer between a training context and a performance context. You'll see transfer to the extent that those contexts overlap in some meaningful way, right? So, i.e., that they contain something important that is the same. So that's why we think learning transfers. Every other disagreement is about what that overlap should look like. So, and one of the interesting little secrets. So I had a PhD student several years ago now who was doing his work, sort of lab-based work on learning and transfer of learning. And one of the things that he did at the time was that he did as part of his PhD, quite a deep dive on the literature and started to have a look at what people thought that overlap needed to look like. And it's turned out to be a topic that's really just it's been a real boom and bust kind of topic. So people, talked about trying to identify, well, you need if you want learning to transfer, then your learning has to include part of the whole. And then the question was, well, what parts? And then people tried that for a little while and it didn't really work. And so people got bored and they went and did other things. And then everybody forgot that they got bored and they started coming back to it because it's still a really interesting question. And they'd come back and try and figure out something else about what was overlapping. And effectively, everybody was trying to find overlap. They were looking in the wrong place, it seemed. And they were all fundamentally kind of doing the same thing, where they were trying to find something crudely, they were trying to find something in the verbal description of the two tasks that the two tasks had in common, right? So my favorite example is a research paper where researchers were looking at, they trained people to either balance on a tightrope or balance on a beam. And they did learning and then they did transfer. And what they found was almost no transfer, right? Even though there was tons of good learning. And the idea that this is surprising comes from the fact that, well, both of those tasks have the word balance in them. And so surely there's an overlap, right? They both involve balancing. So obviously that's not working, right? The way we verbally describe these tasks isn't capturing the underlying reality that the person's actually interacting with. So the pitch for me has always been, what's the point of the ecological approach, right, to practitioners? Well, it's a scientific framework that provides a vocabulary of real parts, things like affordances, perceptual information, all that stuff. It provides a vocabulary of things that we think people, organisms actually interact with. And you can use that vocabulary now to describe your task in a way that's closer to what's actually going on. That's the pitch, right? And that's the pitch of any good theory, really. But that's always the pitch that I've made when people ask me, why should coaches care about science? Well, it gives you a way to talk about what you're doing in a way that we think lines up quite nicely. So my pitch lately has been to use the tools of ecological psychology as the vocabulary that structures the way I talk about tasks. And so, for example, one of the things in the ecological approaches that would never occur to us to say that balance occurred in both of those. One is balance on a slack line, all hyphenated. One is balance on a beam, all hyphenated. Why would we say that? Well, because the ecological understanding is that there's no such thing as a behavior. There's only ever behaviors in context. And the behavior is what happens when people and their environment come together. So if you want to describe the behavior, you've got to describe the people and you've got to describe the environment. That's where behavior lives. That's a key just way of thinking about these things. So using that vocabulary to try and talk about transfer, can we get better? So there were two kinds of things for me that I've been playing with as a way of developing this. One was Danny's thesis work using a very simple lab kind of task when we were looking at learning and transfer in the bounds of that task. And what we found was some slightly surprising patterns of transfer, but we did actually manage to get transfer for the first time in this task. And the reason we were able to get transfer was that we were studying the task in a very ecological kind of way. We were providing people with very representative feedback, right? So traditionally in this field, the feedback has been transformed and turned into something else to make the task easier. But we understand that doing that messes with everything, right? So years ago, in my PhD, I developed a method of providing real-time feedback in this task that didn't mess with the ecological information. Danny's thesis then, for the first time using this feedback, showed not only good learning, but learning and interesting patterns of transfer that we were able to clearly connect to the kinds of information that people were using in the task. We were able to identify what people were doing. And so what's the overlap between the training context and the transfer context? The overlap is information. Why? Well, that's what the organism always interacts with. So if the information that you learn is useful in the task that you're now trying to work in, then you're off to the races. If the information you learn isn't, then you're no good. And so that's part of the story. So there was some cool stuff coming out of that, and we were looking at age-related changes in learning, things like that. The other context in where it's shown up was a project that came out of this collaboration with Southampton. A PhD student looking at the use of virtual reality tools for training in sports. And of course, the huge question there is, can I get you to do something in a virtual environment that then shows up in the game environment, right? And there were two interesting things. We're still working on the data analysis and just finishing all that off to see exactly what happened in our study. But we did a literature review and we published a review just the last couple of months looking at people training decision-making and gaze behavior using VR. And we found two really worrying things. Well, one interesting thing, one worrying thing. The interesting thing is that there are some hints that virtual training in virtual environments can show up in the real world. But the worrying thing was that hardly anybody studying virtual reality was studying transfer because they were just training people in VR and showing people getting back. And the thing that we learned when we tried to study transfer properly was that the reason is studying transfer and game behaviors hard, right? It's very difficult to do carefully and to really kind of illustrate. So, but it's really important. So the thing that's come out, the ecological story for me is you get transfer when your training and your performance contexts overlap. Information is the overlap. It has to be because that's where behavior begins. But it's not where everything begins. So information about what? Well, information about affordances, right? So this then connects up to the whole logic of representative design and the whole ecological rationale for designing training contexts the way that you train them. And then the final piece there is that we've got the logic, we've got the vocabulary, we've got some hints in the literature, but there is still a huge amount of work to be done by people like me in collaboration with coaches and practitioners to really there are demonstrations that this works, but we haven't nailed it yet. There's a ton to do, and it's still a fascinating, really, and it's, as far as I can tell, it's the central question for coaching. How do I make learning move from one context to another context? And all the arguments that we have with anybody are all about disagreements about how to facilitate that transfer. And so, really, I think there's some real opportunities there, but I think there is still quite a lot of work to be done. So it's an interesting time, right? There's reason for optimism, but there's also a boatload of activity that still has to occur.
So, brilliant, thank you. That was what I heard there was just flicking back to something you said there, that the overlap is in the information.
Yeah.
And the information, the affordances are where the information lies. And
Affordances
then
is where the information come from, effectively.
where it comes from, yeah. And so in, for example, a team sport that I'm involved with, a lot of the information is in the interaction. or the interactions, say between teammates and opponents and all of those sorts of things. Those sorts of things is where, so for example, space is completely defined by teammate opponent. And awareness of space for me is probably one of the most central features of skilled performance in a team sport like mine, field hockey, because it's at a premium and in certain and at the area where you most want to be able to score. It's at the greatest premium because it's the most condensed, and it's the defenders are desperately trying to stop you from gaining it, or they're minimizing your opportunities to have it momentarily. So those are the affordances that are very dynamic. They're constantly changing all the time, and in order to attune, in order to gain, in order to experience that, and therefore to be able to then do something in practice which might then help when in competition. The more of you need the information to interact with. So the interactions create the information, and it's the information that where the overlap is going to be. So the more of the relevant information, but specifying is the language, isn't it? Specifying information. The more of the relevant information that's there, the more chance you've got of an individual taking something from that practice environment into a competitive environment.
Yes. Because it has to be that way, because information is how organisms come into contact with their environment, right? So affordances are the thing we're trying to come into contact with, right? We're trying to engage with the opportunities for action and use those opportunities to coordinate and control what we're up to. But it's really important to remember that affordances are, in many senses, they're literally over there. Right. So, there's my sofa, it's over there, it affords sitting, but it's literally over there. So the question is, how does that come into contact with me? Well, that's what information is for. That could be visual information. If it's just making sounds, there's acoustic information. Once I'm sitting on it, there's haptic information, and so on and so on. So we have access to lots of different sources of information, and some of them are useful at varying times, etc. But it's information. That's the point where we come into contact. And the other way to think about it, so now that the ecological community is starting to think about neuroscience and starting to think about what the brain is up to, which has been quite an interesting development, the key kind of intuition there is that what the brain is actually, the main thing the brain is doing is resonating to information. That's the primary kind of thing that we think the brain is up to. There may be more, there may be other internal dynamics going on. That's a question for later. Our basic initial hypothesis is that what brains primarily do is resonate to information. That's a Gibson metaphor. So instead, you're not bringing information in and processing it and constructing things with it, but you are resonating to it, like a radio resonates to radio waves, right? That dynamic attunement kind of notion. And again, it's information that is the first thing that brains interact with, and it's the first thing that we resonate to. And what happens to that next is another question, but you see evidence of this where you can track the information coming in and you can track the information coming out. If you look at the shape and the form of the behavior, you can see the signature of the information in the spatial temporal details of that movement, right? So what the brain is doing is almost passing that along, right? Its job is to get light into the muscles. And that's what the nervous system is, a big thing that the nervous system is for. So, there's so many reasons within the ecological approach to be focused on informational overlap as the behaviorally relevant thing. The second thing that I was thinking about, you were talking about awareness of space, for example, as a key sort of thing. So that's a good place to start, but that's one of those verbal descriptions of the task that in and of itself might not be up to the scratch. So the question is, can we, within that question of awareness of space, what's actually going on ecologically in terms of affordances? So then you started to do the right thing of, okay, within that space, there's affordances swinging in and out of existence, right? There's a gap that's there, that's not there, that comes back. You move so as to create the gap. Someone moves to try and close it off. That works to the extent that they stop that space affording something for you, and so on and so on. So the big trick for us is to turn that description of what you want your athletes to do, awareness of space, turn that into a description of the affordances that are present and therefore the information that's present. And once you've got that vocabulary, once you're thinking and describing things in those terms, then you're much closer to having a vocabulary if we're talking about what that critical overlap has to be. So how do you get the right kind of information in? Well, unless you want to program up a virtual environment and have complete control over everything, which you don't because it's a massive pain, the best way to get the right kind of information in is to put the right kind of affordances into your training space, because then the affordances will interact with the light and they'll produce the information for you. That's what they're for, right? And so and again, this just feeds back. This is what representative design is. If you get the right affordances into the space, they'll produce information about themselves. People will interact with that information. What do they learn? They will learn how to use that information to coordinate and control their behavior. And if those affordances do in fact ever show up in your game, then they will by definition produce the same information and you've learned how to interact with them. That's the whole point. So the ecological argument is that the overlap is in affordances, but critically in information.
So one of the questions I can hear practitioners,
Yep.
and these might be curious practitioners that are very interested in this way of thinking about human learning in this movement context. But they are obviously steeped in a kind of a more traditional learning paradigm that is hard to let go of sometimes, or they're just skeptical. So curious but steeped in an alternative paradigm that's hard to sort of break free from, or skeptical and therefore lots of questions. And so I'm sort of going to play their role slightly.
Yeah, sure.
And one of the things is, so I'm quite comfortable when you talk about when you're talking about sort of putting the affordances in, or it's not a question that it's like a Lego block. I'm going to put this affordance in.
Yeah, right.
I'm going to put this affordance in. What you're doing is you're trying to create an environment that equates to the likely competitive environment as much as is possible given various constraints and parameters.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that affordances will naturally occur in the way that they would occur in a competitive environment.
Yeah.
But the problem a lot of practitioners have, and I have to admit, I have suffered with this in the past. I now get used to this and I'm more understanding. So I understand that those affordances are going to materialize in different ways. And what a lot of coaches who are used to controlling learning environments and wanting to have control is the answer they want is show me how to put the Lego blocks in.
Yeah.
Show me how to have control that the right affordances are going to be put into place so that I can get the right outcomes. Now, it's a very manipulative type of mentality slightly because they want control. And I think this maybe takes us towards this affordance-based control idea that you were presenting, that you were talking about earlier on. Perhaps, I don't know. But it's it's an area that I hear a lot around, and I can sense the tension because a lot of practitioners feel deeply uncomfortable just designing an environment and kind of allowing those affordances to emerge and then being skillful with constraints in order to sort of maybe, draw attention in different ways, shine a light on different aspects. You can become more skilled at that, but it is an ever-changing dance. It's a proper dance with the participants that you're continuously flowing with. And if you get more and more comfortable with that, it becomes quite a joyous experience, actually. But I can understand how a lot of people would feel very fearful, particularly at the elite end, where results matter, and you've got to have a bit more focus and control. So this is where I think a lot of the discussions around it depends comes from. I think some people suggest, I'll do that when it doesn't matter and I've got the opportunity to explore and learn. But when we get into the coalface, I'm going to be much more directive. I'm going to tell people what to do and this, that, and the other. So anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a meandering space, but I just wanted to give you that sort of problem to play with.
So it's funny, the way I think, I hear that problem a lot, and I hear it framed that way a lot. And I was just thinking while you were talking that there's a slightly different way to frame the problem where I actually think everybody then agrees on the shape of the problem. Namely that learning doesn't happen like that. Learning takes time. And one of the concerns is making sure that you take advantage of your limited amount of training time to have people spend as much of that time having the opportunity to learn what you want them to learn in that session. And there is a perfectly legitimate concern. So I can fill that hour with drills, and I know that they have got however many repetitions or exposures, right? It's really easy to look and see how many times they did the thing, right? And obviously, right, there's complications around that, but I get the urge, right? Because you want to make sure that you're trying to optimize your training time and making sure that you're actually filling it with opportunities, right? And there is a very real uh, concern that if you're trying to get affordances to emerge over the course of a representative training design, constrained training environment, over the course of that hour, you might successfully get the affordance to show up 10 times, maybe. And people may or may not have seen it when it showed up. And so there is that loss of control, and there is therefore that concern that you haven't given your learners enough time to learn what you want them to learn. So even if you want them to learn to perceive and interact with affordances, there's a real concern there. So there's a couple of things that occur to me. So for example, when I bring people into the lab and make them learn stuff, I give them plenty of exposure and plenty of opportunities to interact with whatever it is I'm doing. And I can do that because the tasks I'm using are simple and straightforward, and I've got quite a lot of control over whether the information is present or not. That's the whole reason I use those tasks in the lab, right? And as soon as you start doing something more complicated and something more interesting, then that control goes away. Again, this is one of the arguments, for example, about using some technologies like VR. So one of the nice things about virtual reality potentially is that you could put people into a training environment where you give them an interactive, immersive experience in which information and configurations of players and gaps emerging, you can have all of that happening, but you can guarantee it's going to show up because you've programmed it in a certain way, for example. And again, that's one of the motivations for trying to use these technologies. And there's some reason to think that's not a crazy idea. And Rob Gray talks about using VR to try and train people to how to cope with things that are just genuinely rare in your game, right? So I think the issue then is that I think everybody across the board is concerned about making sure that they fill their training time with opportunities to learn. I then do think that there's an element where there is a little bit of you do have to suck up a little bit, that loss of control, the loss of I'm going to present you with an opportunity to learn by making you run in this particular direction or do the thing. And you accept that because what you're trying to train is something different. That I think is the big gap. You have to make that commitment and that understanding that what you're trying to train your learner is actually something different in the two cases. But then I think you're right. I think once you've made that switch, then the kinds of activities where you're trying to create environments and opportunities where you produce these things are interesting and fun, and it can be really interactive, and there's a co-creation element to it. You try things, it works or it doesn't work or it doesn't work reliably. You co-create with your learner about how to try and do this. The thing is, one of the things is that one of the reasons why learning can look quite slow is that if you're giving something, if you're giving, if you're fighting against the way the system likes to learn, then that's going to slow you up. So I can run you through 100 drills, but the reason I have to run you through 100 drills might be that what you're learning in that case is you're not working with the way the system likes to work. So there's a discussion to be had, I think, around the fact that if you give people the opportunity to interact with things in the way that the system is designed to work, namely interacting with information while trying to use that information to coordinate with respect to the affordances of the environment, having that closed loop up and running. So right, let me give you a very simple example from my research. I can teach you to do these coordinated rhythmic movements, very simple, not very exciting, but I can teach you to do them in two ways. I can teach you by showing you displays of how these things move and giving you feedback as you make judgments, picking them out, picking them out of line. And it works and it's great and it shows up and it's useful. takes ages, like hundreds of trials, right? You give me 10 minutes and a joystick and me actually making you move, closing that loop, I can get equivalent performance in a third of the time, probably a quarter of the time. So one of the suggestions is, so it was interesting that I could train you the other way, but it was also interesting that it was a real fight to train you that way. And that as soon as I closed the loop and simply had you use that information to coordinate and control your actions, the learning really just happens pretty fast and is stable and robust and lasts forever, etc. So it's about what you think counts as a good use of your athlete's time or your learner's time. And you're going to use that time differently. But the suggestion is, again, look, I front up. I think we still need a lot more data on this. I think we actually need a lot more work to really demonstrate this more convincingly than has been done so far. I think there is plenty of reasons to think this will work, but I think there's a lot to do yet. But the basic argument is that, yeah, sure, you might get fewer exposures, but those fewer exposures are working with the system, and so you're gonna get much more bang for your buck. So. Yeah, it doesn't solve the fundamental problem though. You have to have a whole separate. I don't think you'll ever talk a nervous coach. Pardon, I'm being a bit glib there, but I don't think you'll ever talk a nervous coach into the ecological approach by telling them it'll pay off in the end, right? Even if it will. I don't think you can quite because I think it requires a rethink of what you think counts as a valuable spending of that time. And I think that's a separate issue.
Yeah, and so I understand that correctly. When you talked about the joysticks and trial and error to a certain extent versus you take control, that my mind went that means that you're basically showing them what to do and telling them what to do, and it gets there a lot quicker. Is that sort of what you're proposing or not? Because I'm kind of
So the structure of those experiments are either I get you to make perceptual judgments about these things and I give you feedback that make those judgments better and better, or I simply teach you how to do the movement with some feedback that guides you in. And like I say, it does work because both cases present the relevant visual information that you need to learn, and that once you learn, and actually you get transfer across those tasks, which is nice. That shows that people are using the information and the information works in both cases. That's kind of a nice demonstration of it. But the critical thing is that when I'm just presenting you passively with some information and having you make a judgment about it, you can learn to make that visual discrimination, and it does eventually help. But it takes forever, and it's really not exciting. Whereas using the information to control the action that is itself then producing the information, closing that loop and actually making it so that what you're doing is what we're always actually doing when we're learning out in the wild, which is moving so as to generate information, which we then use to control the next thing that we do, which then produces information, that perception action loop. As soon as you close that loop, learning it kicks in, right? And so that tells me as a researcher, when I ask someone to do something and it's difficult, and I ask them to do something and it's easy, that tells me that one of those things is working with the system and one of them is working against the system, and that tells me about how the system is organized. This is a fundamental bit of the way scientists go about doing stuff, especially in psychology. We give you something to do, and if it's hard, then we've tripped something up. If it's easy, we haven't tripped something up. And both of those things tell us about how it's wired together. And the critical thing is closing the gap, right? Or closing the loop.
What about, though, the inherent struggle associated and inherent failure that's associated with, when you work ecologically, where there isn't necessarily so to use a sporting metaphor, right? I can get somebody to move in a certain way, carry the ball in a certain way, hit the ball in a certain way, get loads of success. It'll feel easy and it'll feel joyous. Until the moment of competition when somebody else is there and all of a sudden it'll all go pear-shaped. Or I can give them trials with somebody else there, which equates more to the likely experience they're going to have in the game, which is
Yep.
going to have more struggle and failure. It won't feel as easy,
Yep.
but the goal will be that when they're presented with that problem, which will be closer to the problem that they'll be presented with in the game, because there's not
Yep.
going to be people just waving them by like matadors saying, have a crack, right?
Yep.
So it's going to serve them better, but it will feel more struggly.
No,
So how do
absolutely.
you square that off?
So there's a couple of things. Again, pretty much anybody academically inclined who studies learning will all basically agree that if there's one thing we know about movement learning is that variable practice beats non-variable practice every time. So, right, it's a truism of motor learning that variable practice produces better outcomes than, say, blocked practice. But one of the other key things about that pattern of research, that's one of the most robust things, is that variable practice doesn't pay off until later. So, blocked practice, if you do a learning study where we do a little baseline assessment, a bunch of training, and then we do a post-training assessment, in that first post-training assessment, blocked training will usually be doing great. And it might even be probably doing better than variable practice. But if I bring you back a week later to do a retention task when you had no further training, what happens? Well, the blocked practice effect kind of tops out and sometimes dips back down, whereas the variable practice continues to provide improvement. And so that basic effect, like nobody has any problems with the fact that that exists. The question is why, and that's where the stories get different. But fundamentally, blocked practice traps you in one region of the learning space, right? And so and whereas variable practice pulls you around that learning space, and so you just get exposure to more of it, right? Now, one of the things that comes out of this is the motivation issue, right? Variable practice is harder. So there's a motivational issue for the athlete, right? And so that's where you have to be committed, you have to be a team, you have to be working together, and you have to feel like this is a valuable activity, even if it doesn't pay off instantly, etc. And that's a huge issue, right? Like that's a whole extra layer of something that you get to do. But it's funny, I think one of my favorite sort of examples of this out in the world is just looking at little kids who've learned how to ride scooters, right? You get the little scooters that they just kick push, right? And none of them were ever formally taught how to do this. And it was probably pretty difficult at the beginning because these things are hard work until you really start to get the rhythm of them, right? And I've seen kids produce the most skilled, adaptive, flexible behavior in the face of curves, jumps, you name it. And they're having a great time because it feels good to win. It feels good to beat that variability, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of discussions to be had about exactly how to engage that. But I think part of it was that how did they learn how to do this? Well, they just rode them around and they rode them over rough terrain, like, bumpy, cracked pavements, and they had to cope with curbs and bumps and things. And so it slows them up, takes it longer to learn. But because they're doing the right kind of exploration, they're learning to coordinate their activity with respect to information about the dynamics of this scooter. And so even though it takes longer, it takes a while. And the thing was, they clearly stuck with it. So even if the work is harder, right, there was clearly something intrinsically motivating about riding this scooter for the kids that got them through the fact that it was difficult, right? So that's the other thing is, just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's not fun,
Yeah.
and so there's a lot of moving parts there.
So there's something interesting there. And I'll take us on to the next conversation. But would I be right in saying so? I have a slide basically, by the way, which quotes you. It's something you said on the podcast in one of the things. I think the first time we ever spoke, where you said
Right.
variability isn't noise, it's signal, and I think
Mhm.
that's a beautiful encapsulation of what we're trying to talk about. But just talking about that point about variable practice is better than non-variable practice, but the payoff is later.
Yes.
Would that then mean then that would the sort of corollary of that be that non-variable practice gives you an earlier payoff,
Mhm.
but it might not last you very long?
Yeah, it's because that non-variable practice has very quickly taken you to one particular place.
Yeah.
So you've very quickly got to the point where you can do that one thing. Variable practice, very slowly, gets you to a place where you can do lots of things. that's the basic rule of thumb that shows up in the data over and over again, right? And again, it's just about exposure and it's about robustness in the face of slight variation as well. So, right, why is variability signal, not noise? Well, I'm sure it's sometimes noise, but mostly it's signal. Why? Because variability is a feature of all of this, right? This is the classic Bernstein repetition without repetition, blacksmith hammers, right? You name it. I could ask you to do the same thing 20 times, 1,000 times in a row, and you'll do the same thing, right? Successfully reach and grasp the object or swing the hammer or whatever. You'll do the same thing. There's your repetition, but you'll never do it exactly the same way twice. And so that's the without repetition. And that only shows up if you pay attention to not if I just measure, did I successfully swing the hammer and hit the nail? Then yes, every time I'm getting better at hitting the nail, and now I can hit the nail all the time. The without repetition bit only shows up if you look at exactly what's going on in order to make that outcome happen. And this is where all the interesting stuff happens, how the joints unfold over the space, how you organize your limbs. As your arm gets tired, you have to do different things. As you start, every swing starts in a slightly different place. Every swing, you've got your grip slightly different on the hammer, right? So you have to be able to cope with that variability because it's a feature, not a bug, of the problem of motor control, right? This is just the way it is. And so if you can't ride that variability somehow, if you're fighting against it all the time, then frankly, you're doomed. And so, I mentioned sort of the affordance-based control stuff and connecting up to these motor abundance ideas. This has become another interest of mine is just getting bringing an ecological vocabulary to talking, really engaging with this problem because we have to, if we're going to study this and we're going to try and figure out how to do skill acquisition better, for example, we have to know how it works. And if you want to know how it works, you have to front up to the realities of the problem the system is trying to solve. And the reality is that it's trying to produce repetition, stable outcome, without repetition, variable performance. It's always trying to do that. It has no choice. That's simply the way it is. And part of that comes from the fact that you have a lot of moving pieces as an organism. And some of that comes from the fact that the world is a pretty stable and reliable place, but you're never coming at it in exactly the same way twice, right? That gap that affords kicking a ball through sometimes will be right in front of you, sometimes it'll be off to the right, sometimes you'll have to try and create it, and so on and so on. When the gap emerges, the information about that gap affordance is the same because it's a gap affordance. And the information you can interact with it, but you never encounter it in exactly the same way twice because that's just not how things work, right? So if you can't, you have to engage with that variability because it's at the core of everything. And some of that variability is it's great, in fact. It's fantastic that variability exists because then if you build a system that works with that variability, then you get flexibility, adaptability, and creativity. And your job is to live in the zone. The fundamental solution to motor control is not to shut variability out, but to live in the zone where the variability is about freedom and creativity and not about noise. And there is noise, right? There's always some annoying things trying to perturb you in the universe. But your job is to live in a region where the variability is not about noise, but the variability is coming from the flexibility and the adaptability that the whole thing has within it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you made me think of. I was trying to sort of thinking about like variability because the variability is where affordances live.
A little bit, sure.
So just thinking like they're almost like or it's like the kind of the oxygen for affordances, probably the wrong metaphor, but
Well,
uh,
I mean, affordances are. Let me. Actually, no. I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to push back a little bit on that and say that affordances are so right in the framework that I'm thinking of at the moment and been developing. Right, affordances can be variable. When we bring them and study them into the lab, we tend to study the affordances of objects, right? The affordance of this thing to be grasped, right? And we don't randomly change it unless you're doing wacky stuff in VR. We don't do that because that's what affordances are. We do that because it's a group of affordances that are relatively easy to do science on, right? Actual affordances, of course, opportunities for action swing in and out of existence as you go past them, as the gap is formed and then gets closed by. So these things are ebbing and flowing in a way that's dynamic, but still robust and reliable. The argument that I'm making actually these days is that it's the affordance structure that's one of the key constraints on all of this movement variability. So movement variability, we have access to all this redundancy, right? I've got lots of moving parts, but I don't need all of them all the time. So I have to constrain that variability. I have to constrain myself somehow to live in a space where all that variability that is just a feature is showing up in terms of creativity and not showing up in terms of noise. So systems, like the movement system, can constrain themselves to a certain extent, but we also need some additional constraint. And my argument is that actually what affordances are the environment's way of providing a meaningful constraint that can be placed on movement variability. Affordances define what counts as a successful functional adaptive movement. If you successfully interact and complement the environment, the affordance of the environment, then you have produced a functional adaptive behavior. That's what, and that's why we experience the world in those terms. So the affordance provides a key constraint, and it doesn't lock the body down to a single movement, because that would be a terrible idea. What it does is it locks affordances provide a constraint provides you with a range of movements, and it's the thing that defines the range that's good rather than bad. It defines the range that is creative and flexible and adaptive, and it defines the range that is noise. And then our job is to perceive that affordance and use information about that affordance to live in the part of the space that we want to live. There we go. That's a whole bunch of words that I just made up. But that's kind of what's going on at the moment, right? That's what affordances are for.
Yeah, I kind of am curious about this because that's a slight distinction as to my understanding, and it may be because my context makes me think of affordances differently.
Sure.
So, in a scenario where the functional movement solution is more predetermined or clear,
Yeah, right.
then I think that would be true. But in my world, the functional movement solution is defined moment to moment to moment to moment because of a range of parameters.
Yeah. So no, I've been thinking about this as well, and I think the way that I'm talking about affordances is quite happily accommodates your way of talking about affordances. It sounds like I don't, because partly in order to describe it, what I end up describing is a fairly static affordance. What's the current affordance?
Yeah.
And it's hard with language. I've been thinking about how to articulate this. So at any given moment, the environment is affording me some things and not other things. At the next given moment, that field of affordances might have changed. And in the next given moment, the field of affordance will have changed again. I still think that it's the affordance structure that's one of the key constraints on movement variability. I think it has to be. And I think that it's okay if the affordance structure is constantly changing. Because, here's the one key thing about affordances. Even though they're ebbing and flowing and those gaps are emerging and going away, they're not disappearing on a dime. They're ebbing and flowing. There's time, there's inertia, right? These things are not random, right? Things are unfolding according to the laws of physics because they have to, right? There's stability and structure there. So even though there is a dynamic there, things are ebbing and flowing. They're not changing randomly, they're not changing abruptly, and they're not changing unpredictably. And so because those things are changing, even if they are changing, that means that the constraints on your movement are constantly changing, which means that what counts as a functional movement is in fact constantly changing. And frankly, this is one of the things that makes something like football really hard, right? It's difficult to produce a movement to a constantly changing field of affordances. You have to put yourself into kind of a zone where you are allowing the affordances to constrain you. But as your kick is developing, right? You're constantly, when you began the kick, the gap was there. When you're about to finish the kick, the gap isn't. So what do? Well, sometimes you accidentally continue to do the kick, and that's bad. But sometimes, if you're really good and really skilled, you can use the new affordance namely the absence of the gap, an affordance for ill, right? You can now use that to produce a different action, not kick, or you pass, or you do something else, right? And so I think skill is about being able to learn how to interact with this dynamic range of affordances, this dynamic field of affordances. And sports is a particular context where that ability is really pushed to the limit because the field of affordances can change really fast and in really annoying ways. And it's full of attempts at deception and so on and so on. So I think that my analysis, the basic framework and the thing that I'm trying to articulate, it all holds. It just becomes very difficult to talk about as things get more complicated. But this is good, actually. I've needed to sit down and practice talking about this. So does my first attempt to talk about my approach in a way that maps onto the way you're thinking about things, did any of it land, or is it not working here?
Yes, I think because I think I now understand that what you mean is, and I was reflecting on this actually as we were talking, because we use a lot of language artifacts, I think, as shorthand. Even words like when you said motor control, like
Yeah.
it's not really what we're describing. It's not a
No.
control. It's more of a and motor abundance is probably a better description, but people don't know what that means. So we refer back to motor control, and we
Yeah.
really shouldn't be talking about skill acquisition because it's not something you acquire. It's something that you and Keith Davis likes to talk about skill attunement, but again, that's not a commonly used language. So we refer back to skill acquisition because people know what we're talking about, even though it doesn't
Yeah.
describe what we're talking about. And so we're in this constant circle of having to try and reinvent the language to help us describe what it is we're talking about. I think what you were talking about was you were describing the moment in time.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, some of those moments in time last longer than others, but there's
Yes.
still moments in time. And the fact
Yes.
that those moments in time might be, like a film shutter going at, it might be that the scene changes continuously. In some contexts, the scene changes hardly at all. In some contexts, it's changing all the time.
Yes.
But it still means that there is a frame. There's a
Yes.
momentary frame where that affordance exists,
Yep.
however fleetingly.
Yep. Or however it's durably, right? So
Yes.
there's a whole field in ecopsych and adjacent fields called event perception. All right. And one of the things, about what constitutes the now, right? Well, actually, there isn't a now. There's a window that ebbs and flows depending on what you're currently up to. So right now, I'm sitting in my office, in my home. Everything's pretty well behaved, and the only thing I'm doing is looking at the screen and looking to you. Nothing's changing very much. So what constitutes an instant is actually a pretty wide window right now because nothing's changing that much. But as soon as I go for a walk, or as soon as if I go to softball training tonight, right, all of a sudden the pace picks up. And so but that event structure, there's information for that event structure as well. And there's a lot of evidence around the fact that we perceive events actually in the same way that we perceive affordances. Why? Because events produce information too. And so event structure, that ebb and flow of what counts as the window, it's not just that the frames are the same size and they whiz by at different speeds. It's that the frames are different sizes depending
Yeah.
on what you're up to, right? And
Nice.
so one of the things that makes an interception sport like football, for example, what makes it really complicated and really difficult to do well is the fact that that window is, first of all, that window is ebbing and flowing all the time. If you ever watch a game of football, sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's fast, right? So the window is constantly changing, and then the window can get real small, right? That's what makes it difficult. That's what makes it interesting. That's why it's fun to watch, right? Because if you're watching skilled athletes interact with that complex environment, and when they do it in a way that shows that they are attuned to all of that ebb and flow, it's remarkable, right? All our favorite athletes who play any kind of sports are the ones who are attuned to that dynamic. But I think that the story of affordances that I'm telling, where affordances are the primary source of constraint on motor abundance in terms of the organization of the bits of the body, I think that story holds up across all of this. It becomes harder to talk about. I just run into problems where I try to draw graphs to demonstrate this, and I'm limited by the fact that a 2D graph is really easy, but what I really need is probably a 4 or a 5D graph sometimes, and it's like I can't do that. And so, but what I try to do is when I'm trying to tell this story is I have to start somewhere. And actually, I think the whole thing has to start somewhere. And I think the right place to start is affordances for everybody. So I start with affordances and then talk about interacting with affordances and talk about that using to coordinate and control behavior. But then, of course, it's a loop that then has to run. Yeah.
So interestingly, when we were talking, whenever we talk about affordances, I've been playing around with an idea that I keep sort of positing in different places, and sometimes I get blank stares. So it makes me think maybe I'm in the wrong in the I'm in the wrong space. But I'll road test it with you because I'm in a safe space whilst recording this to go out to the rest of the world. Um, but you know how often, so Newell obviously talked about the constraints-led approach, and the articulation was that, we're going to utilize constraints as a method or recognize what the constraints exist. There are various constraints exist, and we utilize constraints in such a way so as to help design an environment that will then produce or present various opportunities for action affordances, and
Mhm.
then the participants can then interact with that environment.
Yep.
And the constraints-led approach has existed for a long time. People talk a lot about CLA a lot.
Yep.
Interestingly, people talk about CLA separately from ecological approach, which I
Right.
sometimes think is interesting. I know it's
Mhm.
nested, but anyway. But
Mhm.
what I was thinking about was with what you're talking about, where the affordances um, actually act as the sort of primary
Mhm.
design uh, kind of it's where you can start your design from. And
Yep.
I wonder whether using constraint-led approach
Mhm.
gets people evoking this idea of, so this is how I can control and to a certain extent manipulate a space in
Mhm.
order to get a particular outcome. So a lot of people
Mhm.
think that CLA, they call it old wine in new bottles. And the reason they say that is because, well, we've been using conditioned games and conditioned activities for ages. And
Right.
the reason they were doing that, though, was to get humans to move in very, very specific ways that they
Yep.
had predetermined as being functionally relevant,
Yep.
not not to use conditions as a mechanism to get people to interact with an environment and attune to affordances is a very different way of doing things. So I think it's a very different. It's not old wine in new bottles. It's new wine in new bottles. But anyway, um,
Sure.
but I was thinking that maybe we would be better off to begin to talk a little bit more about an affordance-led approach.
Mhm.
Because if we work backwards from the affordance in our design, yes, we're still going to use constraints, but I
Yep.
wonder if that would be a better way to talk about it.
Maybe. I'd have to think about that a little. So, right. A couple of things. I'm a little nervous initially, and I'm saying that affordances are the primary constraint on movement organization, and I mean that, and I think it's true. However, I'm worried that primary is the wrong word in the sense that I do think that affordances are they're the thing that kind of define the ground truth of whether or not your movement is functional or not. So the way I go about describing affordances is about in terms of the physical properties of the environment and using that to define what's on offer in terms of actions. And that defines the ground truth in the sense that that notion of affordances says, right, here's what's on offer. So if you successfully effect this affordance, right, what counts as a functional action if you want to hit that target when you throw it or something is like you have to do this. You've got a range of options, but you can't do any old thing. And so if you throw the ball and want to hit the target, then that's what you've got. So the affordance is primary in the sense that it kind of defines the ground truth. There are, of course, however, other interesting constraints. So one of the other constraints on my ability, for example, to throw a ball to hit a target is whether or not I'm strong enough to throw the ball the distance that is required. I still think affordances play a pretty central role in figuring that out. But one of the constraints then becomes actually my physical strength. And one of the ways I've gotten better at throwing is I've gotten a bit stronger in the relevant muscles because whenever I'm playing softball, right, I get a little bit of game fitness, right? Well, less than I used to, as the grey hairs are saying. However, that's the idea, right? But there's other things that I do as well. One of the other reasons I can throw further than I used to be able to is not just strength, but I've gotten better at all the timing, right? So I've gotten better at coordinating my arm to move the force from the big muscles down my arm and I lose less of that. And the coordination of my throw is better. So there are constraints on the organism side, and they matter. I do think, however, that the affordance still, right. One of the other ways to think about this, another way to kind of go at this problem is all of these motor abundance analysis methods, things like uncontrolled manifold and all these kinds of things. What do? All of them look at the variability in movement and they decompose it with respect to a task. Why? Because what counts as good variability is movement that doesn't interfere with your ability to perform the task. And my argument is, well, what's a task from the point of view of an organism? A field of affordances that you're currently presented with. So I think in the long way round, I think what I'm currently doing is talking myself into agreeing with you that the constraints-led approach is the right thing to say in general. When you're talking about self-organizing systems in general, self-organization requires constraints because that structure happens at the boundaries, right? But in the particular case of movement, the particular constraint that leads is the affordance. So maybe affordance-led approach is the right way to do that. Yes, I think you might have. I think you might have allowed me to talk myself into that, Stu. Thanks. I think it makes sense, though. Yes, I've talked myself into thinking it's not a crazy thing to say, and then to listen to what people think.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm open to having challenge on it. It's just a notion that occurred to me. Some of it occurred from, your thinking around affordance-based control, and
Yeah.
I think you're right in the sense that the affordance or the field of affordances and opportunities for action within that field define movement. It doesn't define, and when you talk about functional movement, that does not mean, and just to be clear to people, that does not mean that there is a singular functional movement. It just defines the functional movement. There are an array of movements, some of which will be more or less efficacious in this, given the field of affordances or the opportunity for action presented. And over a period of time, you will begin to work out which ones provide you with the opportunities to interact with that affordance in those certain ways. But it felt to me, I've always thought that if I'm doing design, the affordances need to be the starting point, and then the constraints are used to then shape the interaction in the space.
Yes. So it's funny, actually, just thinking as well about the connection to affordance-based control. So, for your listeners who might not know, affordance-based control is a framework developed by Brett Fagan, who's an ecological psychologist, student of Bill Warren's. And it's interesting as well that affordance-based control and Brett's work really, it's funny, it's actually kind of stands in opposition to a lot of Bill Warren's approach to doing these kinds of things. And it's interesting. There's lots of interesting elements about it, and the way that I'm talking about affordances 100% aligns with Brett's analysis. It's like when I first read that paper in 2007, it really resonated with me, and it's taken me a few years to figure out exactly why, but it really resonates with me because the way I'm thinking about these things fully aligns. But it just occurred to me that there's a final piece here, and that the underlying motivation for Brett to develop affordance-based control was a concern that the Warren-style, just information-based approach that was affordances select which actions you're trying to produce, and then you use information that's not about affordances to regulate and to coordinate and actually produce the activity. Bill has many reasons for arguing that way. Brett's concern that really resonated with me was that not just the selection of which action is appropriate, but the actual fine-tuned coordination and control of the production of a movement also has to be done with respect to affordances, because it has to.
Yeah.
Because affordances define what counts. And so effectively the argument between Bill and Brett basically boils down to, are affordances for the selection of action modes. So I am now throwing, but then the details of how I throw will get controlled differently. That's action. So action selection is I am throwing rather than sitting, or I am sitting rather than running, right? And then there's the fine details of exactly how fast are you running, how big are the steps, how far are you throwing, etc. So, so the argument boils down to, are affordances just good for action selection, or are they also part of how we control the action? So not just I'm currently throwing rather than sitting, but affordances are actually why I'm throwing as fast as I am, or with the angle that I am. And the thing that resonated to me was that Brett's concern was that if you aren't controlling your movements with respect to affordances, then you're actually not controlling and producing your movements with respect to the limits of what's possible, right? So he studies braking and braking a vehicle to bring it to a stop, and braking has to operate with respect to the affordances, because if it doesn't, then you might be braking and producing a perfectly sensible brake, but if you don't know if that braking affords successful stopping, then you don't know how to control them. So anyway, I resonate to Brett's argument. I think he's 100% correct, and effectively everything I'm doing it's effectively one way of implementing an affordance-based control approach. But the key insight is exactly what you were just saying, and this gets back to this point of, should we maybe be talking about affordance-led approach, is that the whole production, the coordination, the control, the selection, and the implementation of all our behaviors is primarily constrained by the ground truth of what's on offer, and that's what affordance is. Yeah, so that's interesting. That links up nicely. And that has a kind of coherence to it that makes me think that maybe once, yeah.
Well, I'm glad I'm not completely mad. There's a kernel of an idea there that I need maybe with your help to sort of expand upon a little bit more. I have been writing about it quite a bit. I'm not in a way that's yet publishable, but it is intended to be. So maybe I'll share with you my cliff notes, and you can tell me where my understanding is lacking.
So I have
Um,
Well, so I've just finished first draft, and it's a first submission of a paper where I'm articulating this affordances as the primary constraint on motor abundance. And so I've just drafted that paper, and so that's under review at the moment for a special issue at EcoPsych, but I've pre-printed it, made it available, and it's got in it my current best attempt to articulate all the things that I've just said in it. Um, and while we've been chatting, I've been thinking about, once that paper's through review and is in good shape, then there's potentially an interesting follow-up making the case for this affordance-led approach articulation of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is for about research, and it's about structuring a research program. So the paper contains a hypothesis that affordances are the primary constraint, and it contains a research method. Here's how you go about studying affordances to show that they primarily constrain motor abundance. There might also be another paper where we've got a hypothesis, a research program, and an application. And the application might be, here's how to talk about, here's how to, because, right. One of my concerns over the years about applying ecopsych to sports coaching, and one of the things that I think the critics bring up and do have a point, is that we haven't quite, we're not quite walking our talk in some respects, I think. And I think there are some gaps in exactly how things get done. I think there's a lack of kind of coherence. And that's part of the approach, right? Having, people trying lots of different things and going at it in slightly different ways. But I do think a little more coherence, a little more structure might not be a bad idea. And again, the whole point of all of this being grounded in the ecological approach is not to just nail yourself to a theory and ride it till you die. The whole point of committing and deriving this from the ecological approach is to use that vocabulary, that hard-earned vocabulary about what we think actually is going on, to structure and inform, and for you to provide you with a vocabulary to describe what you're doing. And yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of good work out there that tries to do that, but something's still missing clearly, because there's a lot of still a ton of pushback about it. So I think one of the lessons maybe to note is that we haven't, as a field, quite figured out how to articulate it yet. Maybe there's also the reciprocal is that, people need to work a little harder at meeting us halfway, but that's,
Well, yeah, but I mean, again, I think the pushback stems in my mind from, I mean, I've been I've come across Madhu Mangalam's writings of late. I don't know if you've seen much of his stuff. It's fascinating.
right.
Um, and he's almost coming out. He's written a few things sort of as a bit of a quite strong rebuttal of things like active inference and Bayesian brain and a number of
Yeah.
others. But he's in particular, um, from memory, I think he's at University of Nebraska, but very, very robust. And I made a note actually when we were talking because I think there's some really interesting areas I'd like to talk to him. But he's been really, very, very, very strong and vocal
Hmm.
about why some of this occurs. And part of it is because, and he's got a really nice turn of phrase. And one of the things he talks about a lot is um, how essentially cognitive psychology, became captured with the computational metaphor, and then it just dominated the
Yes.
narrative to a point where there was no space for any alternative, and anything else was seen as slightly, and we experienced this as ecological practitioners as being slightly heretical, and
Absolutely.
and all over there. And he talks about how, and this is the language I really like, is about how this metaphor now became a proxy for mechanism.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think what we're struggling with is actually we believe I say we, but the ecological community is coming at this from the perspective of mechanism. We believe there is something going on in the way the brain operates that
Yep.
the alternative explanation just doesn't carry enough explanatory weight.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
it has such a dominance in the space, and this has happened throughout scientific history, where there's been dominant paradigms that have sort of taken root and found it been very difficult to dislodge them. But he's
Hmm.
actually come out with some really very strong arguments to basically say it's the emperor's new clothes. It doesn't deserve the kind of the sort of strength, the castle it's built upon. It doesn't deserve it. It's based on very, very shaky foundations that don't need a lot to shift it. And so it's been
Yep.
really interesting just reading that stuff as a sort of passive observer.
So, yeah, I mean, look, I think if you go back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, I do think that the embrace of the computational approach by cognitive science was a good faith attempt
Yeah, yeah,
to do cognitive science in a way that made it rigorous, right? In the sense that, if you go back and look at Newell and some of these early guys, the challenge of behaviorism, the challenge of Skinner and all these people, the reason why things were, locked in behaviorism for a long time was a good challenge, namely, you want to talk about the fact that there's all this internal stuff happening, but you don't have a way of talking about it that allows you to be precise, make predictions, do science, do anything other than come up with psychoanalysis, right? So that was a strong challenge that had to be met. And when information theory and computer theory and all the underlying mathematics and sort of structural features of that, when they came about, the whole point of those things is to provide a vocabulary and a mathematical framework for talking very rigorously about what processing something means, right? And so I think the people who were interested in doing cognitive psychology and wanted that framework, I think they were right to see that the computational framework gave them a large number of very appropriate formal tools for doing the kinds of things that they wanted to do. Now, 60 years later, 70 years later, I'm inclined to think that we have a lot of reason now to think that it was a perfectly sensible way to go about answering the questions as they were posed. I don't think it's holding up as well as people think. I think we have a lot of reason to be suspicious of it, and we have a lot of reason to think that maybe it's not the right way to frame the question. And also, critically, thanks to Gibson, we don't just say, well, I think that one's a bit weird, or I think that one's problematic. We can actually point to, and here's an alternative formulation. Here's a different way to frame the problem. And that's what makes Gibson such a radical and why it's so important is he was, as far as I know, the first person to propose, to even try to propose a theory of direct perception. Everybody for thousands of years has been trying to solve perception as an indirect problem. Gibson, as far as I know, was the first person to propose a theory of direct perception. First of all, to even think that that could be a good idea. Second of all, he proposed a mechanism that allowed it to work, namely specifying information. Then he started talking, then he got to affordances about what that information was about. But that's the thing, that like that's quite a nice ebb and flow, is that you've got a strong, good faith attempt to engage with the problem as everybody had articulated, and you've got this new tool that is spot on the right way to go about articulating all these things. So the Bayesian sort of framework is a really good way to articulate problems if you think the problem is one of inference based on incomplete information. But if you frame the problem differently, then the Bayesian stuff becomes the wrong toolbox and you need a different toolbox. So I think, so I would broadly agree. I like, right, and obviously I agree, right? But I think even, I obviously think that the ecological approach is the better way to go about doing it. But even if I didn't, I think I would like to be able to say that there's now two pretty coherent alternatives. And one of them's been going for a very long time and is really creaking at the seams.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we need to take that creaking at the seams quite seriously. But yeah, right. I mean, as with anything, these changes are generational, right? You get, I'm never going to talk the old grown-ups into this, right? This is why we try and train more graduate students than everybody else, right? So this is, this is how change happens, right? It takes time. And like, no one's going to talk me into being an information processing psychologist, right? But if they might talk potential student into that's okay. That's part of the deal, right? But I'm not the target, and the current generation of people doing this are not the target. The target is, can you articulate the difference and the reasons and motivations for it to the people who are coming up next?
My desire to communicate this is more acute because, I believe there is a generation of young people who are being exposed to a sports experience that's radically impoverished because of the on enduring spectre of the computational and representational approach, which has drawn a generation of practitioners into saying, right, line up, wait your turn. We're going to be doing this movement pattern over and over ad nauseum because you're going to need it sometime in the future. So obviously, I feel a slightly more acute need to try and redress this sort of generational imbalance. That said, I was in a policy making role for quite a while and I wasn't able to really shift the dial that much. So I understand that these things are going to take quite a while, but that's one of the reasons I use this platform, because I know there are a lot of advocates and adherents who want to learn more and they actually want to champion this, and it's gathering some steam and gathering some momentum. Now, I've really enjoyed that. I've absolutely. Why do we leave it so long? We need to, this needs to be a frequent thing. But
Absolutely.
Now, we need to talk about your forthcoming conference because
Yes.
there's might be some people out there who don't know about it, and there's an opportunity to have conversations just like the one we've had, but face to face over a period of 3 days in the sprawling metropolis of Leeds in the north of England, which is one of the most amazing cities that you can ever go to. When is it? When is it? What's it all about? And then we can talk a little bit about how listeners to the Talent Equation may be able to get a bit of a sneak preview deal to get in there a little bit for slightly less than it would otherwise cost them.
Excellent. So the conference is the 16th European Workshop on Ecological Psychology, or EWIP as we call it. So in the research academic community, we've got three conferences. We've got the international one, which bounces around all over the place. It was Norway last year. And then on every alternate year, we have the two regional ones. So there's a North American meeting and a European meeting. And the European meeting hasn't happened since pre-COVID, right? So in 2019, I was in the Netherlands at the international conference and got talked into hosting EWIP in Leeds for 2020. And something happened. I don't know. 2020 went by in a blur, lost track of what was going on. Anyway, didn't happen. But it's taken us this long to get us back on the schedule. So we're back, and it's exciting because there's a really strong community of ecological researchers in Europe. Some in the UK, a lot on the continent. There's big concentrations in the Netherlands. Norway, Spain, France, lots of places, all over the place, and lots of really interesting people doing lots of really interesting things. So it's really exciting that we're back on the calendar and that it's back, and I'm excited to be able to host it here in Leeds, which, as Stu said, is a lovely town. I'm from New Zealand originally, but I always say, like, of all the places I could have randomly ended up by following jobs, I'm super thrilled it's Leeds because it's a great town. And the sun's shining today, so that always helps. So the event is on July 15th to the 18th of this year. So that's Tuesday through to the Friday. So the Tuesday evening is just for arriving and having drinks in the evening and just sort of catching up. The conference itself starts proper on the Wednesday. And we've got the Wednesday, the Thursday, and Friday morning with events. And we have a roster, we have some speakers already lined up, a couple of symposiums. So we have a symposium on notions of affordances and effectivities and thinking about how to talk about what affordances are, and effectivities are what we call the movement component side of things. We've got a symposium centered around motor abundance and thinking about, so I'll be giving a talk on that with some friends of mine, but I'll be giving a talk talking about exactly what I've just been talking about today, thinking about how affordances serve as this form of constraint on movement, coordination and control. And we've got speakers coming talking. We'll hear sort of new things about ecological neuroscience, some applications to sports, some applications to rehabilitation as well. So some colleagues in the Netherlands have just finished a large-scale EU grant applying ecological approaches to skill acquisition to the context of rehabilitation after stroke and injury, sort of not in the sports context, but in the more general context. So yeah, a ton of really interesting stuff. So the structure of the conference is that we all come together into a single location, and the conference costs include all accommodation, all the food, all the drinks, all the conference costs, etc. And the idea, normally what happens with an academic conference is that you go to the talks, and then you have to go find somewhere to have dinner, and that takes 4 hours, and that's very complicated. So what we do for this event, it's a smaller scale event, and the idea is to be a real community building kind of event. So everything's included, and the trade-off, the payoff there is that we all hang out, and we talk to each other, and we have dinner together, and there's plenty of opportunities in nice spaces in the venue, the Doubletree Hilton in Leeds, down by the canals, lovely spaces to sit, talk, interact, network, have chats, and just generally do some community building, form those connections. And it's nice as well because we haven't had EWEC for a while. It's going to be nice to put some of those connections back together again and reconnect with people we haven't seen for a while. So it's a really fun event. It's really low key. It's really friendly, and there'll be a ton of ecological psychologists there, ranging from people with grey hair like me, all the way down to students coming up doing new, interesting work. And yeah, the goal is just to have those conversations. So yeah, there's a real opportunity. If anybody would like to come, we still have space in the agenda and space in the conference proceedings for talks or presentations or some kind of symposium where there's a group of you come together and tell us something. And I think it would be really nice, actually. I think the ecological community, and the ecological research community and the ecological dynamics / CLA community are connected, but not kind of fully, I think. And so for the first time last year in the conference in Norway, I think was probably the first time there was a symposium around research on skill acquisition and affordances and things in sporting contexts. And it was really well received. People were really interested in it, and it was really nice. And, we come to these events to learn what's new and what's going on and what we can feed into. So there's a real opportunity. I'd love to have people come and talk and represent the community, the sporting community, and represent the fact that you exist and you are out there and you are doing cool things and you are doing interesting things that maybe we can help with, or maybe you can help us. We can start to have talks in which we find out what we're all doing so that we can start having conversations about what we can do together to do it better.
Amazing. And we did have a little conversation before we press record about like the creation of a sport practitioner symposium, because I know there's quite a lot of people out there doing some interesting things, kind of sort of more practice-led studies and field notes to a certain extent. I know I'm in the process of writing a chapter on some of my experiences around field hockey that I'd love to road test and get some people's views and just hear some different experiences and ideas. and
Keywords to time
yeah,
of
there's some other people
conference.
out there. So that'll be quite an exciting thing to do. Now, I know we talked this about before. We talked about this before as well. Is that the best way for someone to, if they wanted to get in touch and they're a talent equation member and they wanted to sort of just is to reach out directly to you and say, I'm interested in coming. I'm a talent equation listener. Can I join? And I think you're even prepared to say, actually, if somebody can only come for like maybe 1 or 2 days, then that's also a possibility for some people as well. You haven't got a specific pricing for that on the website, but that is something that you'd be able to put together for somebody if that was there, if they were sort of limited by funds or whatever.
Yeah, so right. So I described the basic design of the conference, and it is a key kind of design principle of the conference that we all come together and hang out and all that sort of stuff. However, it's much more important that people are there than not there, frankly. And so the basic, like I say, so there's a website that's hosted on the Leeds Beckett University site. If you search for the ecological workshop on, sorry, the European workshop on ecological psychology, and if you put my name in, then you should find the website, nice and easy. And it's got all the information on it. So that, yeah, as Stu mentioned, the current pricing and organization around it is premised on the idea that we're bringing everybody together. And I think if people are up for that, and if there's a group of you would like to come and present a symposium, or even come and present individual talks, or just come and hang out and chat, I think that would be fantastic. But like I say, yes, absolutely, I'm fully on board with. I think I would much rather have people come if they can. So I'm more than happy, basically happy to try and find a way to get you to come. Reach out to me, drop me an email, and just put eWeb or something similar in the subject line so that I know what it's about. And I'm happy to have a conversation and try to find a way. And if you want to present, or if there's a group of you, or whatever, there's plenty of opportunities to interact and contribute. And if you want to just come and enjoy the talks, then and hang out and chat too, that's fun as well. But yeah, I think I'd really like to see some representation of the sporting world, and the fact that we have a whole domain that's really kind of excited and interested in the kinds of things that we get up to academically, and that there's, forming those connections and finding ways to work together. There'll be some opportunities in the conference actually to talk about how to apply for large scale research funding and what constitutes collaborations and how can we go and investigate that. There's a lot of interest in really building a more larger scale collaborations between all the European contributors, right? There's loads of us around and we all know each other and we hang out and we meet, but we don't always work together all at the same time. And there's a real interest in really starting to take advantage of the fact that there's a ton of us around doing a lot of really cool things. So there'll be lots of opportunities and lots of interest in talking about finding ways to work together to solve problems that we're all collectively interested in.
Cool. Well, I'm definitely going to be there, and I'm definitely going to encourage as many of my listeners to attend. Also, my learning community, the Guild of Ecological Explorers. I know many of them are kind of interested in getting along, and many of them are actually actively involved in producing some written materials for a forthcoming book that we're all collaborating on. So I'm sure they've got stuff to talk about, and it would be great for us to all be able to get together and do all that. And
Yeah,
also, the Sky Bar at the DoubleTree is really something. A place to have a nice drink and overlook the skyline of Leeds. It's actually quite a place to be. So
it's
that
quite
will also be a highlight.
first went to check it out. I have to say, I was impressed. I thought it was pretty cool. I've lived here for a long time, and I was like, "Oh, is that what we look like from a long way out?" That was fun. It's really nice, and and like I say, hopefully, it's a community building opportunity, right? And it's time to connect and start just chatting to each other again. We've got all these opportunities, podcasts and things like that, but nothing beats sitting down with a beverage of your choice and just chatting face to face and nutting some things out. It's the way to go.
Cool, Andrew. It's been great having you on. Really enjoyed
Pleasure,
the
Brendan.
conversation, and I'm looking forward to the next one, which won't be as long a gap between this one and the next one.
Excellent.